Um, see, before I actually jump into evaluation of patient with male infertility, I want to talk little bit of physiology. I'm not going deep inside physiology, but little bit of physiology because at the end of the day, what I found, irrespective in male infertility or female infertility, if we again go back and study physiology, most of the answers we get. It is a physiology which is telling us the treatment, evaluation, follow up, everything. So to come by the definition of azoospermia, when we are really apprehensive, when we need to actually evaluate is when the patient is having azoospermia, that is defined as absence of sperms on a standard microscopic examination, that is in the semen analysis. It is very important for us to see at least two semen sample. The interval varies, probably I would say at an interval of 4 to 6 weeks. So if both the samples show that there is no sperms and you have centrifuged it at least for 15 minutes with 3000 rpm and you have examined the pellet and both the times you could not find any sperms in the ejaculate, then probably that is the place we put them as azoospermia, and then that is the time we actually decide that yes, now we need to start evaluating him. We need to see what is the cause and try to treat it. So as I told you before I go for the evaluation, I want to talk a little bit of physiology. So if you see the male reproductive system, it constitutes mainly four categories. That is, one is the important testes, then the epididymis, then the transport vas, then the accessory glands like prostate, seminal vesicle, ejaculatory duct, other things which are in the surrounding structures. So coming to one by one, this is the anatomical pictorial diagram. So now, what does the testis do in the body? It has got two main functions as far as we are concerned in reproductive medicine. One, the spermatogenesis, that is the production of sperms in the semen. And second, the testosterone production, that is the hormone, which is again needed for some purpose, which will be coming back. So now today we are going to discuss about this spermatogenesis. Means there is no sperms, means there is no spermatogenesis happening. And this spermatogenesis happens mainly in the testes. Now, what is spermatogenesis? Spermatogenesis is production of sperms, that is from an immature sperms to a mature sperm, which is happening in the seminiferous tubules which are present in the testes. As we all know, there are millions and millions of seminiferous tubules inside the testes. Now, these contributes to 80% of the testicular volume. And there are other cells like, Leydig cells, Sertoli cells, supporting cells, which are just only 20%. Now, why is this important is, now see, when there is a damage to the seminiferous tubule, when the seminiferous tubules are not present, or when the sperms are not present in the seminiferous tubule, you will see that the testicular volume will drastically reduce. Whenever we talk about obstructive, non-obstructive, how do you differentiate? We say, what is the testicular volume? If the testicular volume is decreased, then we mainly take it as primary testicular failure. It is because of this. That's 80% of the testis is occupied by the seminiferous tubule, and when there is a damage to this seminiferous tubule, when there is a problem in this spermatogenesis, automatically the testicular volume should come down. Now, whatever the sperms which are produced, it ultimately drains to the epididymis, and in the epididymis, we know there is head of the epididymis, middle piece, and the tail of the epididymis, and then it goes to the vas deferens, and from the vas, it will enter the urethra, and it will be ejaculated. Now, even in the epididymis, it's very important for us to know the head, middle piece, and the tail of the epididymis, because we don't want to take these sperms. Imagine if it's an obstructed azoospermia, then we know the more the dead sperms, the more of highly stored, probably 3 week storage sperms will be seen at the tail end of the epididymis, whereas the fresh produced sperms, the fresh released sperms will be seen at the head of the epididymis. So probably when you're doing a epididymal sperm aspiration, you would want to put a needle at the level of the head to get more sperms which are better competent DNA than taking the later or the unhealthy sperms which are present in the tail. So it's Important again to know the anatomy and physiology of not only the testis but also the epididymis. Now, this is what I was talking to you about. They start as spermatogonia, then it undergoes several cycles. Initially, it undergoes mitosis to form spermatogonia B. Then there is two levels of meiosis, meiosis 1 and meiosis 1, where they get converted into spermatocyte 1 and spermatocyte 2 and form spermatid, and ultimately it forms the mature sperm. Now, why again this is important is there can be an arrest in this meiosis. When there can be arrest in the meiosis 1 or meiosis 2, accordingly we call them as early maturation arrest or the delayed or the late maturation arrest, because sometimes we get a histopathological report. You do a testicular biopsy, you get a report saying that there is a early maturation arrest, there is a late maturation arrest. So we don't know what is this. That is, the spermatogonia have not able to get transformed to sperm, but they have got arrested in between. Imagine if they got arrested at the level of spermatid, then probably it's a late maturation arrest. But unfortunately, even a spermatid cannot be used for ICSI purpose. A spermatid or a spermatocyte 2 cannot be taken out and injected. It cannot form a baby. So we need to wait till the sperms are forming. Okay, so this is all about the spermatogenesis happening in the testes. As I told you, the another function happening in the testis is the production of testosterone. Now, this testosterone is produced by the Leydig cells. Now, there are millions of Leydig cells again present in the interstitial space adjacent to the seminiferous tubule, and these cells are directly under the control of luteinizing hormone. Now, what does this hormone testosterone do in our body? That is, the first is it causes inhibitory feedback effect on the pituitary LH secretion. So this is very, very important. We always say, like, don't supplement any male with testosterone who is actually planning for a baby. Because when you supplement directly with the testosterone, this causes negative feedback on the pituitary and it suppresses the endogenous testosterone and they might go for azoospermia. We usually see many of the patients in my clinic who go for gym, who wants to build up the muscles because they are protein anabolic and growth promoting effect. So they take lots of hormones without knowing that they are testosterone for their growth promoting, for their muscle promoting, and they come to the fertility clinic because of this LH feedback mechanism saying that, I have azoospermia. Apart from spermatogenesis, it also maintains the male secondary sexual character, and also along with the FSH, it helps in spermatogenesis. Since it has a role in the spermatogenesis, that's why usually when we are treating a patient for hypo or other people where the spermatogenesis is not possible because of altered hormonal menu, we give them FSH with HCG, and we know that HCG is a surrogate of testosterone. Okay, this is the pathway which we have to know in a male, that from the hypothalamus GnRH is released. GnRH acts on the anterior pituitary and releases FSH and LH. FSH acts at the Sertoli cells, and these Sertoli cells are the place where this spermatogenesis is happening. Whereas the LH acts on the Leydig cells, and Leydig cells in turn secretes testosterone, and testosterone in turn enhances the spermatogenesis. Now, both Sertoli cells secretes inhibin, which has a negative feedback on the anterior pituitary. These Leydig cells again has negative feedback on the anterior pituitary and the hypothalamus. So this is very important because your whole evaluation of the hormone analysis, your whole idea of giving the treatment all depends upon this cycle. And whenever you want to actually probably, you know how to plan the evaluation, we usually categorize them into three groups: pre-testicular causes, testicular causes, and post-testicular causes. Then it becomes easier for us to find what is the problem and investigate them. There are few people, they don't take it as pre-testicular, testicular, and post-testicular. They take it as either obstructive causes or non-obstructive causes, and depending on that, they start evaluating. But it is person to person, but it doesn't matter, you take it as step 1 or step 2. If you're taking it as obstructive azoospermia, it is the inability to detect the spermatozoa in the ejaculate because of some obstruction on the outflow. Before we say it's an obstructive azoospermia, we have to always rule out the retrograde ejaculation. Now, why I have put this etiology is because if you see the etiology, all the causes of the azoospermia or male infertility comes inside that. So when you're asking an history or when you're probably ordering an investigation, if you know the causes, probably you can easily ask. For example, if you're suspecting an ejaculatory duct obstruction, then you do probably a transrectal ultrasound. You will easily know what is the diameter of the seminal vesicle, what is the diameter of the ejaculatory duct, whether there is any agenesis of the ejaculatory duct, and you will know whether it is obstructive or non-obstructive. We know that if there is a congenital bilateral absence of vas, just feel for the vas at the scrotal or the groin. If you cannot feel for the vas, then directly you can say that it is because of obstructive azoospermia. Similarly, if as a child, if they are exposed to some infection, it can be in the mumps, or it can be a viral orchitis, or it can be a fever which was uncontrolled, or they have underwent some surgery like vasectomy, hernia, bladder neck surgery. So the moment the patient says that, yes, I underwent a bladder neck surgery, probably then we can say that, okay, this might be the cause of the azoospermia. So if you know the etiology, then probably your history taking, examination, and ordering the investigation becomes very easy. Similarly, non-obstructive azoospermia on the other hand is because of the spermatogenic failure, and it is not because of obstruction. There is a failure in the spermatogenesis at the testis itself, and hence there is azoospermia. So similarly, the most common cause of non-obstructive azoospermia would be genetic causes or the testicular dysgenesis. So that is the time we actually go on ordering for all the genetic tests like chromosomal analysis, Y microdeletions, or cystic fibrosis factors, all those things. Or it can be acquired like, torsion, trauma, or they're exposed to some cytotoxic drugs, chemoradiation, oncologic drugs, or they have some systemic disorders. So once we know the etiology, it's easier for us to evaluate. Okay, now since having a little knowledge on the physiology, what testis does, what are the cells it has, how it, the hormone controls, now let's jump into the actual topic. How do I evaluate this patient? Now, why is it becoming so difficult for us is because there is no doubt that most of the gynecologists are actually not trained, or they are very little trained in handling the male infertility. So always what they do is they just refer the male infertility to a urologist thinking that they are better than us. In turn, what happens is the urologist doesn't give it as a real major profession. They have lots to do like renal transplant or a TERP or a ureteroscopy, but they don't have much time dedicated as a full-fledged andrologist. So even by the gynecologist, even by the urologist, the patient has been neglected. And added to that, there is so many investigations, there is so many things coming up day to day, and there is lots of controversies involved that we don't have any clear picture that should I do this, should I order this test, and can I go ahead with this treatment? We don't know. And when it comes to the reason for male infertility, it is multifactorial. There might be a single factor which is causing him the infertility, or there might be multiple factors which is causing him infertility. So all this put together, probably I think that the male factor is actually more neglected than the female factor. So, okay, now when do I start evaluating the male partner? There is no difference when to start a female partner or male partner. The day you start evaluating the female partner, the same day you need to start evaluating the male partner also. Sometimes you might have to start in the evaluating the male partner as early as possible if there is an obvious infertility risk factors. If he says that, I had a trauma, I had a surgery, there was undescended testis at my birth, the doctor has said that, it cannot be done. So if there is an obvious infertility risk factor, then start evaluating as early as possible. Or if they're already 35 years and they're coming to you very late, then start immediately, don't wait. Or the couples who have a reason to question their fertility, they think that, I'm doubtful, so start evaluating. There is nothing wrong, then we can start evaluating in all these circumstances. So as any evaluation is concerned, even male infertility evaluation includes history, it includes examination of the genital and the general physical examination, the basic semen analysis, the hormonal evaluation, genetic evaluation, and if you have a good urologist, then a urological evaluation. Now that is what I have put it to you in a when I said the etiology, that's why I put these slides of etiology of obstructive and non-obstructive spermia, because you need to ask any history of fever, any history of surgery, any history of drug intake, any history of cancer, any history of chemoradiation. So all those things comes in the history taking. And if I talk to you about any specific surgery that, yes, these surgeries, if the patient is mentioning it to you, you have to be very cautious. So what are those surgeries which are very, very much related to the male infertility? Is one is vasectomy or vasectomy reversal. We know that definitely they should be having some problem with the semen analysis. Orchidectomy for some reason, orchidopexy for undescended testes, if they have undergone varicocelectomy, if he gives an history of testicular torsion, testicular trauma, tumor, hernia repair or hydrocele repair, any of these surgeries, basically any surgeries which is happening in the pelvic region, retroperitoneal region or the genital tract region, it should be given more weightage so that we can come to a conclusion that what probably the cause might be. And examination, again, it includes the both general physical examination and the genital examination. The first is we have to look for the secondary sexual characters. As I already told you, the testis produces the testosterone hormone, and this testosterone hormone is responsible for secondary sexual character. If the testosterone is not produced sufficiently, for example, in primary testicular failure, then they may not have a good secondary sexual characters, or if they're having some chromosomal disorder like 60 to 70% of them are usually Klinefelter syndrome, then they might have a unicoid appearance. Some people might have gynecomastia. That means that there are estrogen dominant environment rather than their androgen dominant. There might be situs inversus, which is seen in immotile cilia syndrome or the Carta-Janus syndrome. So there should be a complete general physical examination. Then you have to look at the male genital organ, look for the penis, look for hypospadiasis, look for severe chordae, examination of scrotum. The scrotum should be always examined in a warm room, not in a 18-degree air-conditioned room, so that there is a relaxation of the cremasteric muscle. You can appreciate the anatomy more better. You should also look for any scars on the scrotum or on the genital tract or adjacent to the genital structures. Then you have to feel for the testes. In the testes, the most important thing what you have to look is the volume of the testes and the consistency of the testes. Both of these things are very important. Like before I told you, like 80% of the testes has semiferous tubule. So if there is defective spermatogenesis, then there is decreased testicular size. So decreased testicular volume is again a very important predictor of altered spermatogenesis. Similarly, the consistency. So these two has to be examined properly. And whenever, in case if somebody is doing an ultrasound, scrotal ultrasound, if your radiologist is repeatedly giving the size like 3 into 2 into 1.5 centimeter, tell them stop giving the size. I don't need the size. All I need is the volume, because it is the volume which will tell you the what should be done. It should not the size. Third, again also examine for the epididymis, because as I told you, epididymis, there is head, body and tail. If there is epididymal obstruction, see, most of the times if there is an obstruction, the obstruction is most of the times in the epididymis, because epididymis is the one structure which is more prone for infection. It can be bacterial infection, viral infection, and post-infection they get obstructed. And these infection might be suggested by the presence of induration on the epididymis, or they can be seen as a cystic dilatation of the epididymis. And definitely examine the vas. Sometimes there might be absence of vas on both the sides, that is congenital bilateral absence of vas difference. Sometimes there might be absence of one side and the another side might be present. So once you have done the examination part, the first test you will order is the semen analysis. So the semen analysis, it should be taken by a masturbation. We usually say the abstinence of 2 to 5 days, but now those concepts are not much there. This is the WHO recommendation in 2010 that the semen volume should be at least 1.5 ml. The sperm concentration should be at least 15 million per ml. The total motility, that is the grade 1 and grade 2, should be at least 40%, and the grade 1 motility, that is progressive motility, should be at least 32%. The normal forms, that is the morphology, should be at least 4%. So this is what the WHO 2010 has given the guidelines. So if your semen analysis is according to this or more than this, we are not worried. And if it is less than this, then yes, then we are worried. If there are no sperms, then we are worried more. Okay. Then you also look for the volume. As I told you, the volume should be at least more 1.5 ml or more than 1.5 ml. If the volume is very less, then it gives us several information. That is, it can be just a false impression that, he has not given the full sample to us. He has just given, because you have told it as a sample, he has also given a sample of semen analysis and he has discarded most of the things. Then you might have a low volume. So you have to tell them, I need the sample right from the starting of ejaculation till the last complete drop. Or there might be a failed emission, like as I told you, there might be a retrograde ejaculation happening, so that the emission what is seen outside is very less. Even in cases of short abstinence, the volume will actually reduce. So once you rule out the first three causes, he says, no, there is no short abstinence. He says that I'm giving the whole sample. Then you can think of these conditions. If the patient is repeatedly giving you a sample which is less than 1.5 ml, then you have to think in terms of congenital bilateral absence of vas, or it can be an ejaculatory duct obstruction, or it can be hypogonadotrophic hypogonadism, or it can be a retrograde ejaculation. Now, why is this important is, here if you see the beauty, the last three, that is ejaculatory duct obstruction, can be treated. The hypogonadotrophic hypogonadism can be treated. Retrograde ejaculation can be treated. So once if you know, and once if you carefully see, and once you know these three is the cause, once you treat accordingly, there is a normal semen present in the patient's ejaculation. Okay. Can I do ultrasonography routinely? I'll come to that. So now, what are the ultrasounds probably we might think for a male infertility? One is transrectal ultrasound, the other one is a transscrotal ultrasound. But in case if you're suspecting that patient is having congenital bilateral absence of vas, then also you need to do an abdominal ultrasound, because they can be associated with renal abnormalities like renal agenesis. Okay, now I'll come to the transrectal ultrasound. Now this is according to the ASRM and the ISHRE recommendation, what I'm telling you. So according to the ASRM recommendation, when a transrectal ultrasonography can be done is, it is indicated in azoospermia patients where there is palpable vas and a low ejaculate volume. So this typically fits. The volume is less, I can feel the vas difference, but there are no sperms. So there is a doubt whether is this an obstructive azoospermia. So, and most of the times if their normal volume test is also with the low volume ejaculate, then to rule out ejaculatory duct obstruction, you need to do a transrectal ultrasonography. Sometimes not only in azoospermia, even in oligospermia. There is some experts recommend transrectal ultrasound even for oligospermic patients. That is, where there is low volume ejaculate, where the vas is palpable, where the testicular size is normal. Then again you can ask for a transrectal ultrasound, because sometimes ejaculatory duct obstruction may not be complete, it might be partial. So you still have sperms, but not to a full extent of sperms. So they might produce with an oligospermia. Again, when you this ejaculatory duct obstruction is surgically treatable. Look in the ultrasound. You look at the seminal vesicle. Usually, if you see the anterior-posterior diameter of the seminal vesicle is usually less than 1.5 centimeter. In case if it is an obstruction in the ejaculatory duct, then the seminal vesicle anterior posterior diameter is more than 1.5 centimeter. So if your radiologist gives the anterior posterior diameter of the seminal vesicle is more than 1.5 centimeter, then it goes more in favor of ejaculatory duct obstruction. In addition to that, they might also have a dilated seminal vesicle, a dilated ejaculatory duct, or a midline prostatic cystic structure. All of these things will suggest either complete or partial ejaculatory duct obstruction. Okay, now scrotal ultrasound. You know that most of the scrotal pathologies are palpable on physical examination. So most of the pathologists, when I say most commonly which is seen is varicocele, spermatocele, presence or absence of vas, epididymal cyst. All these things actually don't need an ultrasound for us to say. Clinically itself, by palpation we can know it. So routine scrotal ultrasound is not indicated in evaluating the male infertility. It is more of a clinical examination which is needed. But still, there are few people who might need scrotal ultrasound. So again, the ASRM in the history, I have indicated scrotal ultrasound in few people. So if I say who are those people who might get this scrotal ultrasound, is if they're very obese patients where you cannot come to a conclusion with your clinical findings. When the patients have high located testes, you are unable to actually say the consistency and the volume of the testes, or those with an history of surgery in the scrotal region or a groin region, there is extensive fibrosis, there is extensive scarring. Again, you are unable to actually give a picture, or there is a coexisting hydrocele, or there is a patient with post-operative recurrence of the varicocele. So probably these are the patients we need to ask for a scrotal ultrasound in addition to clinical examination. But routinely, there is no role for scrotal ultrasound for all the patients for male infertility. Now, when you send them for scrotal ultrasonography, now again, what is the clear message you need to send for your radiologist? You need to tell that, I am interested in two things I should know. One is the testicular volume and testicular volume, and second one is the varicocele. Now again, this is what I'm telling you. Tell your radiologist to calculate the volume, and it is very simple. Breadth into length into width into 0.5 centimeter. 0.5 gives you the testicular volume. The normal testicular volume is between 15 to 20 ml. If they're giving you a size like 3 into 2 into 1 centimeter, I don't know, because all your guidelines, your SFA, Australian, Canadian guidelines, when they say the testicular volume is less, they say testicular volume is high, but they never say the size is more, the size is less. Even the cutoffs, if you say, if the testicular volume is less than 8 ml, then we almost say them as a peanut testes. Means these testes are destructed to a great extent that, the chances of probably getting the sperms even on microtissue is very, very, very unlikely. Between 8 ml to 15 ml, we say, okay, they are in the process of destruction, but still they are little early to us. If the volume is between 15 to 20 ml, then they are of good volume. Then when they're looking at the varicocele also, probably there are few things which varicocele again is a diagnosis by clinical. I want to stress it is again by clinical, but still your radiologist is giving you information, then probably I think you can start using this Chartesi classification. Now, what is the difference between the normal and Chartesi is normally what happens is this is what your radiologist will give. There are dilated pampliform plexus. The diameter of the plexus is around 2 mm, 3 mm, 4 mm. There is retrograde flow during Valsalva maneuver. So if they're giving you this picture, then probably I would say that if the radiologist says it is more than 3 mm dilated and there is a retrograde flow during Valsalva, it is equal to clinical varicocele. If it is less than 3 mm dilated, then it is subclinical varicocele. 2 mm to 3 mm, it is subclinical. More than 3 mm, it is clinical. What I mean to say is, if he gives 3 mm, if he gives, there is a retrograde flow, if you call that patient, if you do an examination, you should be able to appreciate the varicocele clinically. That is the point I want to stress here. And this Chartesi classification, what is the difference is, here they look three major things. One, they look at the dilated veins at the level of groin, at the level of the proximal segment of the pampliform plexus, and at the level of the lower scrotum. So they are looking at the upper part of the scrotum and at the lower part of the scrotum. In addition to that, they're also looking whether there is any testicular hypertrophy or there is no testicular hypertrophy. Now, why is it important is clinically, because if there is a testicular hypertrophy, then they fall under grade 4 or grade 5. That means these people are having severe varicocele. That is, these people definitely will need varicocele surgery, because if you don't do them, then they go into more testicular atrophy. There is huge damage of testis secondary to varicocele. Today they are ligating only the veins at the upper scrotum, but they are not ligating the veins at the lower scrotum. So probably this classification would be more useful if you give it to your radiologist for you to say whether you need to do a surgery. If you need to do surgery, what are the veins I should ligate, where should I ligate? Okay, that was the ultrasound evaluation. Now we'll jump into the endocrine evaluation. That is, what are the hormones I'm supposed to actually order for a patient with male infertility. Now, should I order this endocrine evaluation? Because I see most of the IVF centers, they come second opinion, third opinion with me, and when I see the reports, they've written semen analysis, semen culture, and all the endocrine evaluation, penile Doppler, scrotal ultrasound, transrectal ultrasound, God knows everything. And if I first take a semen analysis is normosospermia. And I don't know for a normosospermia why they have to do so much, including DNA fragmentation at the first visit itself. So what the point I want to stress here is, the endocrine evaluation is not done for everybody. It is done only for these three indications. That is, if you find there is an abnormal semen analysis, that is, if you find the sperm concentration is less than 10 million, order endocrine evaluation. If it is normosospermia, don't do endocrine evaluation. If there is an impaired sexual function, like as I told you, testosterone is not only helpful for spermatogenesis but also for sexual function. So if they have impaired sexual function, then probably you need to do an endocrine evaluation. Or you find any clinical findings, like as I told you, gynecomastia, or any clinical finding which is suggestive of specific endocrinopathy, then you do endocrine evaluation, but don't do endocrine evaluation routinely even for normosospermic patients. So what are the investigations you have in your mind? If you see the ASRM and the ISHRAE guidelines, they order first two investigation. One, that is the total testosterone level, and second, it is FSH plus LH or the FSH alone. Only if these two investigations are abnormal, then they go for extensive investigations. But in Indian scenario, I feel this group of investigation should be done for you to have a consensus on what probabilities. So the investigation which you should be probably ordering is the total testosterone, FSH-LH, the estradiol, to look for the testosterone to estradiol ratio. Inhibin B is not done, it's only from the textbooks. Prolactin, TSH and HbA1c, these are not given in textbooks, but I clinically feel that prolactin, we know when there is high prolactin, it suppresses the FSH, it suppresses the pituitary, it suppresses the LH, and they might present you with hypo features. So prolactin you should do, and we know TSH is interlinked again with the GnRH. It controls the reflexes, hypo or hyper. So TSH has to be done, and HbA1c and RBS. I've seen if there is some 10 patients and all the 10 patients are having abnormal semen analysis, I give for all the 10 patients the medical management. And in those 10 patients, imagine 5 people are having uncontrolled blood sugar, and the other 5 people don't have any blood sugar. And when they come to me after 2 to 3 months of medications, those people who did not have diabetes, they respond very, very well, excellent for the medical management or for the varicocele surgery. But those people who had uncontrolled diabetes, who had HbA1c of more than 7, whatever the medications or whatever the surgery you give, the response to those is very, very, very less. So later on, I made it as a mandatory that, every patient should have HbA1c. And if their HbA1c is more than 7, before I start doing varicocele surgery or before I start implementing the medical management, I tell them very clearly that, your HbA1c should be less than 7 or 6.5. And then only whatever the medications I give will act on you. So these are the endocrine evaluations. So let me go one by one. I don't know if you can look at this chart, but I'll try to read, because this chart gives a very simple orientation of what this hormone does. If there is a normosospermia, that is what I told you, if there is a normal spermatogenesis, then you will have normal FSH, normal LH, normal testosterone, normal prolactin, because there is no abnormal seen. Whereas if you're seeing a patient with hypogonadotrophic hypogonadism, that is they're coming with azoospermia, you order for these investigations, FSH is low, LH is low, testosterone is low, then it is because of hypogonadotrophic hypogonadism. That means that the pituitary itself is not producing the hormones. If it is not because of prolactin suppression, then prolactin will be normal. Then third condition is complete testicular failure, means the testicular cause, the seminiferous tubules are damaged. Then there is an high FSH, high LH, because the brain is trying to rectify it and the brain is trying to increase the levels. Now, when I say what is high FSH, the cutoff is 4 to 8. When your FSH is more than 8, or few books says that when it is double, probably I can say when it is more than 8, then we take it as high FSH. So when the FSH is high, LH is high, the testosterone is either low or normal, then we call them as primary testicular failure. Sometimes it can be hypergonadotropic hypogonadism. That is again nothing but the primary testicular failure. And I told you, you should also know whether it is a prolactin secreting tumor. In prolactin secreting tumor, you will find that there is a high prolactin, and this high prolactin will suppress the GnRH, and hence they will have low to normal FSH and LH and low testosterone. So these vaguely will give you what probably it's a pretesticular or it's a testicular or it's a post-testicular cause which we are dealing now. Now, few words on each individual hormones. If I say FSH, this line is very important. See, a normal serum FSH level does not guarantee the presence of intact spermatogenesis. However, an elevated FSH is indicative of an abnormality in spermatogenesis. Now, what does this say is, if the FSH is elevated, then there might be an abnormal spermatogenesis. Even if you do a TISA, you may not get the sperms. Okay, accepted. In fact, in the Western countries, like the Canadian Urological Association, American Urological Association, European Urological Association, actually, they don't do TISA, that is testicular sperm aspiration, if there is a low volume testis and a high FSH, because they clearly say there is a high FSH, low volume testis, it's a primary testicular failure. So they directly go for micro TISA. They don't do a diagnostic TISA because they know that the chance of getting sperms are very less. Now, the first line what I'm telling you is, when people call me to do a diagnostic TISA and I do a TISA for them, then I tell this there is no sperms available on diagnostic TISA. Even the primary consultant, the gynecologist, the first question they will fire at me is, sir, how is it possible this patient has got a normal FSH? So they believe that since on evaluation there was a normal volume testis and a normal FSH, they should have got the sperms. Why I did not get any sperms? So this is what, so normal FSH does not guarantee. Now I'll give you a clinical example. Imagine you are dealing with a condition which is called as maturation arrest, what I was talking to you about, probably like an early maturation arrest. Now what happens with this early maturation arrest is, there is sperms present, but they're immature sperms. So since there is spermatogenesis happening, the brain does not increase the FSH level. Since there is spermatogenesis happening, the testicular volume also is not reduced. So the FSH is normal, the testicular volume is normal, but the embryologist will not be able to find any mature sperms. So still they come with a report saying that they are azoospermia. So I keep on telling even my co-colleagues that don't get deceived. Don't assure your patient that since the FSH is normal, you will get these sperms. So the normal FSH does not guarantee the presence of spermatogenesis, but an elevated FSH, yes, they are indicating of abnormal spermatogenesis. Now, how many times should I do? Because we know that gonadotrophin levels are variable in the human body because they're secreted in the pulsatile manner, but still a single measurement is usually sufficient to determine that the patient's clinical endocrine status. Now, less than 10% of the cases of male infertility are caused by primary endocrine defects. This is one which I don't like, because the rest 90% of the times I say that no, I cannot do any medical management for you. Only 10% of the people I can say, yes, I can do some medical management for you. Even if you see the correlation between the FSH and the testis volume, if you see more the volume, I told you the testis volume is between 15 to 25, more the volume, lesser the FSH level, lesser the volume, more the FSH value. So these two will give you as a predictor for the availability of these sperms. Now the second investigation what we do is the testosterone level. When you're telling the testosterone level, please ask for total testosterone, not for free testosterone, because I see again many people coming with free testosterone because it doesn't give us much information. We need to do total testosterone levels. The normal level is between 400 to 800 nanogram, and if the testosterone levels are decreased, then there is a problem with the testis function itself. If they are less than 300, then they should be treated. There are two ways you can treat this testosterone. One, if the testosterone estradiol ratio is less than 10, then you can give aromatase inhibitors like letrozole or anastrozole. Or if the ratio is more than 10, but still the testosterone is low, then probably you can give a surrogate injection, that is the HCG injection, weekly 2 or 3 times for 3 months to 6 months. Then another investigation is serum prolactin level. Even in males, less than 15 is normal, more than 15 is abnormal. We know that because this high prolactin level will suppress the hypothalamo-pituitary gonadotrophic GnRH levels. It can coexist with the hypothyroidism also. Inhibin B, I told you it's more of theoretical, we don't use clinically, but inhibin B has also been proposed as a marker for spermatogenesis. Their levels are significantly lower in infertile men than in fertile men. So definitely you can do a inhibin B if the patient is affordable, and this line is more important because they correlate better than FSH levels with sperm parameters. Now the genetic testings. So there are 3 genetic tests which we have to probably be asking when you're dealing with a case of male infertility. One, the Y chromosome microdeletion. Second, the normal chromosomal analysis. Third, the cystic fibrosis gene. Now, where all do we ask this investigation is the cystic fibrosis gene is ordered when the patient has got azoospermia, and on examination, you see there is congenital absence of either bilateral VAS or unilateral VAS. Now, if you see CFTR gene abnormality or mutation is highly associated with congenital bilateral absence of VAS difference. Almost all men, that is 100% of the people who have cystic fibrosis will have absence of VAS difference. And on clinical examination, when they have congenital absence of VAS, when you ask for cystic fibrosis mutation gene, 2/3 of the men will have positive for these mutations. So clinically, if there is a congenital bilateral absence of VAS, is less common because of low penetration. So once you find that there is positive for CFTR gene, you should also call the female partner. You should also screen the female partner, because if both are carriers, then you might have to do a genetic counseling, because these couple might give a abnormal baby. Okay, then the other investigation what you can order is the chromosomal analysis, because we know there are 6 chromosomal disorder like Klinefelter syndrome, which can lead to azoospermia. There is X-linked disorders which can lead to azoospermia. There is autosomal disorders which can lead to oligospermia or azoospermia. So by doing a chromosomal analysis, we come to know what is probably the reason for SOAT or for azoospermia. And most of the times, 70% of the times, 2/3 of the times, the most common chromosomal anomaly found in SOAT or in azoospermia is the Klinefelter syndrome, that is 47XXY syndrome. And if you are ordering the chromosome analysis in azoospermic patient, there is 10 to 15% chances that their analysis comes abnormal. When you are ordering in a normozoospermic patient, there is less than 1% chances that it will come as a abnormal chromosomal analysis. So any patient you are dealing with abnormal semen analysis, that is severe oligoasthenotetatospermia or azoospermia, we should ask for chromosomal analysis. One, we know what is the reason for the abnormal semen analysis. Second, they need to undergo a genetic counseling and avoid it getting into the offspring. And third, we know that the more the chromosomal anomalies, the more the chances of abortion, the more the chances of congenital anomaly, the more the chances of treatment failure. Okay, then I think why microdeletion slide is gone. Yeah, then I'll say orally why microdeletion. When it comes to why chromosomal microdeletion, there are 3 genes what we look at as A gene, B gene and C gene, depending upon they are in the proximal segment deletion or the middle segment deletion or the distal segment deletion. Now, why is this important is, if there is an A deletion or a B deletion, then the spermatogenesis cannot happen. So even if you're doing TISA or even if you're doing micro-TISA for these patients, you will not get these sperms. The chances of you getting this sperm is probably 0%. So you can directly tell them that you are a candidate for donor, you are not a candidate for any other manipulation. Whereas if there is Y microsome C deletion, then they have 50% chances that they will get sperms on TISA or micro-TISA. So we can confidently go ahead with the procedures and they can have their own offspring. Second, these Y chromosome microdeletion are dominant deletions. So if they have these deletions, and in case if you get a sperms and you create a baby and the baby turned out to be son, you need to caution the couple that that son will also have this Y microdeletion. That son also will have azoospermia and infertility. So they can opt for a pre-implantation genetic PGS screening. Okay, so these are the major evaluation which you need to do. So I'll be concluding here, but before that I want to just show few, probably one minute on the procedure which we do. So this is the TISA what I do. For TISA I don't use a syringe. I use 18 gauge butterfly needle. So it's a very simple technique. Hold the testis firm and insert the 18 gauge needle and tell your assistant to give suction aspiration with a 10 mm syringe, and take one tubule will come in that aspiration. That one tubule is placed in the petri dish in the media and given to your embryologist. So it's a very simple technique which makes less hematoma at the site. So this is my second video which I do when I don't get the sperms on testicular sperm aspiration. Then I do extraction. Then this is open extraction. I do a random sampling. Here take a 11 number blade, again give a traction on the testis, cut open the skin. The moment you cut open the skin, the next structure you get the dartus muscle, then you get the tunica vaginalis. So hold the tunica vaginalis and cut open the tunica vaginalis, then you will find a white glistening structure covering the testis, that is tunica albuginea. Now you have to make a small nick on tunica albuginea, or you can take a small syringe and just puncture the tunica albuginea. You will see that the seminiferous tubules will just flush out. Few people just cut it with a syringe, but scissors, but I don't do. I just pick out few seminiferous tubules through a forceps and give it for the examination. Then close the tunica albuginea either with Vicryl or Prolene. Then close the tunica vaginalis again either with Prolene or with a monocryl. Then close the silk skin and the darter muscle. The third video is, I think it's getting repeated. The third video is the microtisa. Same thing, when I don't get testis, even in open testicular extraction, I extend the scrotal skin, I enucleate the testis outside, I cut open the tunica albuginea perpendicularly, and then I expose these seminiferous tubules under 400 times magnification, and I look for the, if you see, I picked up the opaque and dilated seminiferous tubules. So I keep searching for those opaque and dilated seminiferous tubules. When I see those opaque and dilated seminiferous tubules, I pick them up, I give it to my embryologist and wait for his call. And trust me, 70% of the patients where we did not get sperms on normal testicular extraction, we get sperms on micro dissection. Then I close the tunica albuginea with Prolene or with Vicryl 30 or 40. Perfect hemostasis is very important because we don't want an hematoma to happen either in the scrotum or in the testis. Then the testis is placed back inside. I put a midland scrotal incision, if you see, because in the same incision, if I don't get sperms in the right testis, then I can easily deliver the left testis in the same incision and proceed for the another. This is again varicocelectomy. There are two varicocelectomies which we do. One is micro varicocelectomy and the other one is the laparoscopic varicocelectomy. I want to stress only 2-3 points because we again ask the surgeons to do it, but I think as gynecologists we can learn this. You cut open the retroperitoneum. Once you cut open the retroperitoneum over the testicular vessels, you will usually find 2 to 3 dilated veins. So now if you see, I'm trying to separate this fat. These are not fat. These are actually having strands of lymphatics. In addition to the lymphatics, there is also testicular artery inside it. You can see one here. This is the testicular artery. Now what the urologist will do is, they will clamp the whole chunk of this and with a clip and they will cut. When you clamp the whole chunk, what happens is you are occluding the testicular artery also. Can you see that the testicular artery is pulsating here? I have separated it. And then I will actually clamp the testicular vein separately and I will cut it. So what the surgeons do is they clamp even the testicular artery because it's easier if you don't dissect it. But the moment you compromise testicular artery, your results will fall down. Second, you can see these white strands. Can you see? It is hitting your eyes, these white strands. They are nothing but lymphatics. When you cut those lymphatics, most of the times post-operatively, they will have hydrocele. They will have again pain. But if you're not cutting it, if you're separating the lymphatics, if you're separating the testicular artery, then they don't have any hydrocele and they also have a good recovery. So this is the point what I wanted to stress. So when you're calling your urologist also, tell them that, don't en masse clamp it for me. And this is the last video of mine where when I do a open inguinal, subinguinal microvaricocelectomy or a varicocelectomy, this is my old video, but now I've started using even the Doppler. Now again here, what I want to again stress is the moment you identify the spermatic cord and you are now lifting the spermatic cord up, always do a subinguinal incision, not the inguinal incision, because subinguinal incision, as I told you, I can actually deliver the testis out also. It's in the lower pole of the scrotum, and I also ligate those vessels so that there is no. Now I have started using the microscope. So under the microscope, I can see even the small dilated veins, which I will ligate. And always tell your urologist to use Doppler perioperatively so that, before you ligate any vessels, keep the Doppler probe. The moment you find they are not artery, then cut it. Because in my practice, after starting using the Doppler probe, I found sometimes two testicular arteries. And when there are two testicular arteries, I'm happy because those are the people we actually will have good show of semen analysis post-operatively than a single testicular artery. And when you compromise the testicular artery, the results are bad compared to those people who have not compromised. And this is another technique, what I call them a screening technique. If you see what is happening here, the screening technique is after we ligate, again we come from front to back. We are seeing if there is any dilated veins. So this is very important for us to screen, because initially when you see there may not be dilated veins. Once you ligate all the veins, the smaller veins will start dilating. So this is what is the Mark Goldstein technique under the microscope. After you finish, again come back from first to last, look for any other dilated veins, because the new veins will now bloat up. So go on doing like this till you find no dilated veins after ligating all the veins. So to do this procedure, it takes at least 45 minutes to 1 hour. So if your urologist says I can finish varicocelectomy in 15 minutes, then please don't call him, because he is not actually separating everything.